Welcome everybody, my name is Martin Perks and I shall be chairing this discussion tonight as best I can, given our illustrious panel of speakers. So this is called Crisis is the New Normal, What is a Resilient City? So I'm briefly going to introduce it as I see the discussion, and then I'm going to introduce the speakers, a very, very brief biog for each. In the order they'll make their introductions, and each of them got 5 minutes, not a lot. However, we've got probably another 20 minutes for the panel to have a discussion amongst ourselves to kind of warm each other up in terms of their arguments. Before I want to open out to yourselves, the audience, which are, you know, in my view, the most critical kind of component of this discussion, which is really you and your opinions, because I'd like you to pose questions, even argue with what you've heard so far, because I think it's very important that we sort of get behind the headlines of these discussions, because it really helps us understand it in a far better, greater kind of amount of detail. And then if we haven't ended up in fisticuffs, which I very much doubt, I'll ask the speakers to come back in reverse order and sort of sum up the night in terms of what they have got out of it. So, for me, resilience, I think, can be sort of perhaps summed up in sort of 2012 by what happened with Hurricane Sandy when it blasted the east coast of America, especially New York, because it smashed up large parts of that city. It caused maybe sort of 60 billion or so worth in damage to New York alone. At its height, over 7.5 million people were left without power, and it included, 125 people died in America and many more in the Caribbean too. So, it sort of helped spark off some big debate about the need for now what we call resilience. And even in a city like New York, perhaps the world's second best city, which, is historically known both physically in terms of its architecture, even morally and culturally, as a place that was supposedly able to deal with anything, including 9/11. But it seems like Hurricane Sandy, from my sort of understanding, sort of made it sort of take stock of itself and sort of shook it to its core somewhat. And it seems to have had some kind of ripple effect in other areas, especially amongst kind of architects and planners, that other sort of potential natural and man-made disasters, including infrastructural problems like potential power outages, even things like cybercrime, to the potential spread of disease and illness like bird flu, have made many architects and planners, it seems to me, and even city mayors, question, whether cities like theirs are good places, and even if they have done enough, historically even, or in the future, to prepare for these potential catastrophes or disasters that might be lurking around the next sort of month or two. However, perhaps, lest we forget, aren't cities a wondrous example of human creativity? At least they are in my mind. And aren't they really a testament to our also risk-taking sense of ambition? And also being able, therefore, to be able to deal with whatever is thrown at us. Surely that's really the history of a city like London. Or rather, perhaps, the debate about resilience, isn't it also a sort of reflection, perhaps, of our deep sense of anxiety about what we're able to cope with as sort of humans and people, that perhaps it's a sign that we are no longer confident in being able to shape the world around us as compared to perhaps how we built and delivered and designed cities in the past. So my sort of question, I guess, my point of view is, in terms of the future, should we plan and build for the future by consciously, thinking about measures of how to protect ourselves for, potential unknown risks? Or should we really be bold and be done with it and sort of deal with whatever's thrown at us when it occurs? So that's how I kind of understand it. So now I'm going to introduce the speakers, and then in the order they're going to come back to you. So first of all, Irina Bauman, on my far right, so Professor of Sustainable Urbanism at Sheffield University, co-founder of Bauman Lyons Architect. Next to speak will be Christine Murray, editor of the Architectural Review on my immediate left. Next will be Robin Nicholson, far left, CBE Senior Partner, Cullinan Studio, NHBC Foundation Expert Panel. Please come back and explain what that is. Sorry. And then finally to speak will be Austin Williams, who is also the co-founder of the Future Cities Project, who is Associate Professor of Architecture, XJTLU, and again you can explain what that means, or what that stands for, China, and he's also the author of The Lure of the City from Slums to Suburbs. And I'm Martin, and I'm a co-author of Big Potatoes, the London Manifesto for Innovation. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the microphone on to Irina, who's got 5 minutes to make her case on resilience.
Okay, thanks. This is blinding me, so I'm just going to stand up, if that's okay. Because I knew I was going to be first, I thought that I'd take the luxury of setting up the debate in a way which is comfortable to me. So the first thing that I would like to say is that I have no doubt whatsoever that we still have choices about what kind of future we prepare ourselves for. But there is a fallacy ingrained in the question, the title of our debate, which is the crisis is the new normal. And of course, crisis cannot be the new normal, because crisis is part of a dynamic cycle of adaptation. And there is a name to that cycle. It's called panarchy theory. And basically, Hollins, who is a Canadian ecologist, coined that phrase. And he says that all systems, small and big, and we are part of that system, go through the same cycles of adaptation. And resilience and crisis and resilience are part of that cycle. And he identifies 4 different stages. The first one is the wonderful stage, the kind of optimistic stage. It's when the resources are abundant, in abundance, creativity is at its peak, everybody is creating new ideas, new markets are growing everywhere. He calls this stage growth and exploitation. It's very resilient, it's very diverse, this stage, but it's not very well connected. It's not very efficient. There's lots of waste. People are inventing the same things. So the second phase follows, and that phase is called growth. In that stage, everybody gets a bit bigger, companies grow, they get a bit fatter, they get more greedy. Does it sound familiar? They beginning to lose some resilience and diversity. They're becoming very comfortable and self-protecting. And they, because of this, they're very well connected. They spend all the time connecting each other to themselves. And they lose sight of the outside world. They lose sight of changing markets, changing social conditions, changing technologies, new opportunities. And they become very vulnerable. They become vulnerable to shock, and when the shock comes, some of them completely disintegrate. Does that sound familiar? So that happened in 2007 when the financial system started collapsing. This is exactly what happened in that cycle. So after that second cycle, there's a third one, and that's called release. When the big shocks happen, the big organisms disintegrate. And that can happen very quickly. And then the 4th cycle begins, the 4th cycle of adaptation, when again everything's fractured, lots of creativity, lots of new ideas, lots of self-exploitation, new markets out there, a lot of optimism. And this is where we are now. Those three cycles are exactly where this debate is positioned. We have we still have the conservation phase, big organizations holding on to what they know and love. We have crisis after crisis after crisis, and we have this incredible burst of creativity and energy in this city, especially so. So really the big question for this debate to me is, how are we going to handle this? How is this new phase of release and new regrowth going to deal with the conservation and the big guys who are still holding on to the power? This is where the answer to resilience lies. Because if the system doesn't go through a 4th cycle, if it collapses after the release, it leaves the cycle altogether. And this is the option we all have. We might just completely leave the cycle. Okay?
Thank you. So next is Christine.
Hello. Well, interestingly enough, I was going to talk about adaptation. So the Rockefeller Center is supporting 100 resilient cities. You might have heard about it, and this and they're supporting it financially and intellectually. And this is the appointment of chief resilience officers for cities around the world. They've chosen 100 cities. And the idea is that cities have a lot to learn from each other when it comes to preparing for what they call shocks and stresses. So London has one, Glasgow has one, Bristol has one, New York, places in Colombia, all over the world. And the officers are supposed to work across all departments. That's one of the rules of engagement, of getting your funding, is that you have kind of an overview, and you're supposed to create some kind of synergy in the approach of these departments to not only to crises, but on a day-to-day basis. In the literature, from 100 Resilient Cities suggests that while a city is preparing a crisis plan in case of an act of terrorism or a riot, it might also be simultaneously working on an ongoing program that tackles, for example, unemployment or antisocial behavior or social cohesion, so that you can not only prepare for a crisis, but that in the act of preparing for a crisis, you can actually prevent it. So knowing how disjointed government departments can be, where the people in charge of infrastructure, education, or health don't tend to speak to each other, and they might in fact be commissioning architecture or pieces of city on the same street without ever working together, it doesn't seem like a bad idea to have someone coordinating these things. But on the other hand, this is how cities tend to be made. They're mostly crowdsourced, with people working next to each other without necessarily working together. In South America, for example, 80% of construction might be unplanned or illegal. And being prepared for disaster might be a good thing, clearly, having a plan for how to bring in food or care for people or evacuate people. But I'm interested in this conceptual question posed by the panel about what kind of architecture or place does an infatuation with resilience generate? So what kind of city would that be? I think resilience, the word itself, suggests a kind of impermeability, and again, this speaks to kind of our human need to protect ourselves, and it's this resistance to change, or a sense that maybe we could bounce back to the status quo after a brief and upsetting interlude. In architecture, though, we normally, or at least I tend to normally, or sometimes we discuss a successful building as being future-proof, not only by its durability or longevity, but its ability to be adapted to new or different uses. And in that sense, we see change of use as inevitable. If it can be a factory, a place of worship, housing, or an office, then we see that as a good thing. So while resilience suggests bouncing back to the way things are, we seem to like cities that can absorb or embody change in their very fabric. And there's a lot said about the Georgian terrace in this regard. And I see this, a city or a building that absorbs or embody change is something that we're seeing more and more of, even when it comes to disasters. I mean, in terms of floods, we talk about projects that can live with water or without. I think these two philosophies, the one of resilience and adaptability, are somewhat at odds with each other. One is an architecture that adapts is, on the other hand, not a resilient architecture. It's an architecture that moves on. And one seems to accept in its very fabric the inevitability of an unforeseeable and unknowable change in the future, and tries to prepare for that very unknowability. The other, like this chief resilience officer, tends to prepare for every possible happening. So is a resilient city better than one that is designed for an unknowable future? Certainly, I think the resilient city is a more idealistic notion, but history tells us that places change dramatically over time in unforeseeable ways, and we can't design for unknown knowns, so we just try to do a good building or a good place with spaces that might be used in different ways, that might survive or cope, but not resist future temperatures, earthquakes, or flood levels. The Resilient Cities website suggests that we can design out poverty or crime or flood risk altogether. I'm all for synergy across government departments, but I think it's unlikely that we can design out change, looking purely not at disaster relief programs, but at the design of public space. I think flexible and adaptable city is more future-proof than a resilient city. It's a place that's prepared and open to any kind of dramatic change, which may also be, of course, an opportunity. And that's all.
Thank you. Next up is Robin.
Good evening. I'm being very direct. I'm going to try and answer the three questions that Martin put to us, which, first of all, being a war baby, the capacity to bounce back is an essential part of my cultural formation. I know how to make do and mend, and if I can, I'd rather make something than buy it. When I look at TV footage of war-torn cities like Damascus, I weep, but I have no doubt about those people's capacity to rebuild them. The question is, for whom and to what end? For money, for faith, or for a more creative future. I do worry, however, that we all are continuously bombarded by advertising to buy new stuff we don't need and many can't afford. The second question was about resilience. Is, I believe, an ongoing process. I think I might be changing my view about resilience as this evening goes on, but anyhow, about what we mean. I think I can hear Austin snorting about the precautionary principle, but vigilance would seem to me to be a sensible approach, but this is not to be mistaken for timidity. For example, we have just now embarked on 5, or will it be 10 years of a radical conservative government as a result of Ed Miliband's timidity. Resilient cities need vision and community engagement. Architecturally, we seem to have our heads firmly in the sand, building like mad all over the world, with almost zero feedback on the social and environmental impacts of what we do. Every day I cycle past the most elegant, fully sealed, all-glass residential tower called Lexicon on the City Road, and it comes up occasionally over there on that screen. But I have to remind myself that it exhibits as little precaution in the face of our changing climate as one might think of as unprotected sex. As an architect, this is the third answer, I don't see any conflict between constraint and opportunity. The problem with architecture is not the lack of intellect, talent, or skill, but rather the lack of constraints. Like civil engineers' love of big projects, such as HS2 or worse, the entirely unnecessary Thames Tideway Tunnel, is seldom restrained by doubt. This means that we Thames Water customers will be paying £4.2 billion for a tunnel to take away the very rainwater that we need to keep our city green. So, having answered the 3 questions, just as the overworked S word, there are 3 dimensions of the resilient city for me. Economic resilience. Our commodity brokers in the city continue to speculate with limited global resources in yet another bounce back by big capital. Meanwhile, the power is shifting as we are the subject to a new colonialism by Qatari, Indian and Chinese investors. Most politicians welcome this as they see it as growth-driven economic success. But surely the limits of global resources mean that we should be working towards a steady state economy. As for you, if you have one, your pension is likely to be invested in big pharma, unburnable carbon, and in the UK, unnecessarily air-conditioned offices, whose long-term values are very far from certain. On the social front, in many circles there is a growing understanding, though probably not in government, of the need to provide support for balanced communities. There are many inspiring examples of self-motivated, engaged local commute groups up and down the land. Meanwhile, our city here is threatened by a combination of untaxed rise in land price, the bedroom tax, and the new empty encouraged by our mayor. Environmentally, for 5 years, we've generated at home a third of our energy on a listed building in Highbury, using technologies that are getting cheaper and more effective all the time. But can we persuade our neighbours to do the same? No. I am fairly convinced that resilience requires, requires local management, if not ownership, of water, waste and energy. I'm nearly there. At the tail end of the new Labour government, our Zero Carbon Schools Task Force advised Ed Balls, the Minister, Secretary of State, that to reduce our emissions by 80%, all he had to do was to encourage schools to halve the demand, that's easy, double the efficiency, that's easy, and halve the carbon in the supply, that's a bit more difficult and beyond the individual school, but entirely doable. Balls accepted the report and implemented all our recommendations, only for Michael Gove to bin the lot 5 months later, without even bothering to find out the impact of what we were doing. So, even with good advice, we're all going to need to be a bit more demanding, but less greedy, i.e. more resilient.
Thank you. Finally, Austin.
Thanks very much. Okay. just have 3 points. I'm going to take a look at critical engagement on the issue. I want to take a look at, in some ways, what resilience is. We've skirted around that, but I think it's worthwhile looking at. And then what I perceive to be some of the problems with the discussion and with the term. So it's reasonably well documented, I would say, that there is very little critique or criticism within architecture, whether that's architectural journalism, no offense, or intellectual criticism, or even political criticism. Even though it's kind of personal or a superficial level, there is criticism, but in general, at depth, there seems to be a lack, and we all seem to recognize that. So when we talk to people about resilience, people can sound critical, but very often they're just complaining that resilience doesn't go too far, or hasn't gone far enough, or fast enough, or hasn't been implemented in the way that they would like. So in some ways, it's not exactly a Socratic dialogue about the meaning of resilience, but rather a bit more about fine-tuning or tick-boxing. One of the reasons I'm on the panel is because the organizers spent 3 days trying to find somebody who would be in some way against resilience, and there is no such thing. So I am it for the evening. So in a lot of ways, resilience has become mainstream. We don't really know what it is, but it's mainstream. And if you look at the RIVA conference in a couple of days' time on resilience, it's a love-in rather than a meaningful discussion. It says that the aims will be to establish a vision for city resilience, designing a strategy to support it, and facilitate cross-agency, cross-sector, and cross-discipline collaboration to achieve it. We don't know what it is, but we really want it, apparently. So, and if you look at any students here who are designing, if you try to design in your final project a non-resilient building or use unsustainable materials, you will fail. Try it. It's a really good, it's a very good research exercise. The thing is that, even for students where you're not going to kill anybody, nobody's going to build your building, even within that academic world where ideas should be free floating, you're still maybe not allowed to say it, because there's an orthodoxy around this discussion which I worry about. So the first point, I think, is to break free from the resilience debate as an orthodoxy, the new sustainability, as people have called it, and try to reason through what it is that you think about it. And since I've been teaching in China for 4 years, I'm actually reminded daily what a fundamentally important thing it is to have a reasoned debate about some core issues. So I think one of the purposes of this discussion, I hope, is to say that you can reflect on the topic. If you, at the end of reflection, you endorse it, you support it, you like it, you agree with it, that's fine. But I think it has to be the result of a dialogue. Cardinal Newman, who I always throw into conversations at this point, said that the opposition of education is not ignorance, it is one-sidedness. And I think that's worth bearing in mind. Anyway, so what is it? Who is it? What are we all talking about? Resilience is sustainability with bells on. If you think that it's the triple bottom line that Robin put forward, actually the resilience is the bottomless pit. I mean, it's anything you want it to be. The world's first chief resilience officer, Patrick Ortinelli, said you could say anything is resiliency. Obviously, he's American, he can change the word at whim. You can say anything is resiliency. If I talk creatively enough about a pothole replacement program, I could say there is an effort in resiliency. So that's on the other side of the pond. The Guardian here, which is championing resilience, says one strength of resilience is that it can address life expectancy in Glasgow, population retention in Dakar, and religious clashes in Ramallah. So this should make us pause for thought about the overclaiming and the fatuousness of some of this debate. And I really think we need to ask some questions. Gone are the discussions in terms of life expectancy in Glasgow, gone are the debates about healthcare, in terms of population retention, development, and war. We don't talk about these things anymore. We have an urban discussion about resilience. Design thinking is the new way forward, apparently, rather than politics. So, in one critical, because the international relations debate is kind of quite strong on this. So there's one critical international relations paper from Sheffield which likens resilience to a neocon strategy, a right-wing agenda that withholds state provision and encourages individuals to take responsibility for society's failings. I'm not that paranoid. I don't believe that people who believe in resilience are neocons, but I do think that some of the discussions we need to kind of take apart a little bit. Just bear with me one second. Resilience is not a neocon plot, but I think that things like the Rockefeller Foundation, this kind of 100 resilient cities program, again, needs to be questioned. It's done by a philanthropic organization, so apparently that's okay, but they say we will select 100 cities from around the globe and provide finance and other support for putting in place new city resilience leaders. In Singapore, that famous liberal state, they say they will negotiate agreements and serve as the single point of contact for mayors and city managers. This is, who are they? Right? Who are these people, right? This is an imposition on an anti-democratic basis. Judith Rodin, who gave rise to this talk, Crisis is the New Normal, says that her job is to monitor those authorities that the Rockefeller Foundation Fund is supporting and close down departments that are no longer deemed to be performing. So, watch this space and watch your back. So the final point, I think, is that sustainability used to be an unfortunate necessity. I think resilience is something that celebrates restraint, and there's something perverse about a resilience officer saying we used to think about shocks as surviving them, now we think about thriving under them. And the spirit of resilience, I agree with the panelists, is a wonderful thing about human spirit to overcome danger and disaster. But there's something terribly fatalistic about the way it's being presented today. The idea that we almost revel in disaster and cling to tragedy as a way of building solidarity. So I have gone over time, which I'm saddened by, because I timed myself. But I think resilience is a mechanism for making potential danger into a permanent state of alarm. And the problem is that if we see the world through a prism of harm, and that harm is the thing that's giving us meaning, then we won't be able to build a society that actually feels a need or an ability to overcome it. Sorry, thank you.
Thank you, Austin. Perhaps as Austin's outlined, at least for me, I'm not really sure what resilience is anymore, because we seem to have sort of four very different but perhaps common kind of perspectives. So, to start with, is Austin's sort of contention that it's the sort of new orthodoxy, the sort of the sustainability with bells on, is that actually the right way to think about resilience? And if so, also, can you help me by understanding where does it really come from? Who wants to have a go? Yeah.
I'm not quite sure why Austin is so heated up about this concept, because resilience is really a way of understanding some of the things, some of the shifts which are happening in our society. We understand maybe for the first time in a very long time that we are not in control of our destiny, that man is not the only controller of our destiny, that we are in a partnership with much greater forces, and that in order to move from the current state of existence, which is clearly not going to create survival conditions, we'll have to withstand some massive repeated shocks to our systems. So we either are resilient to them and are able to withstand them and create a more sustainable environments, or we simply exit the cycle.
So, Ari, can you just explain a bit more, though, because you talk about these sort of forces, you outlined that in your introduction. I'm not really clear what they are and what sort of, where they come from. So,
well, they're all man-made, aren't they? So, first of all, there are the climatic forces, which are way beyond our control now. They will be impacting on us whether we like it or not. And there are other man-made ones, like the discrepancies of wealth, which are creating incredible tensions in our society. There's also the fact that some of us have much more than we need, which makes us very unhealthy and very unable to survive with less. So many issues, many situations that we created, which are now set in ecological systems in motion, which are greater than we can resolve, and hence the permanent crisis.
Okay, feel free to come back to what Irene has said, but also, Christina, again, you sort of confused me about resilience, perhaps in a kind of good way, because you talked about more the importance of adaptability, I guess. But isn't the kernel of what you're arguing about being adaptable also about managing risk and disaster and so on? You know, relevant to the discussion we're having today. So isn't it the same, doesn't it start from the same kind of premise that, shall we say, natural or man-made forces are out of our control? We need to find the best way to deal with it, which in your case is adaptability. Is that right?
I think perhaps my point of difference is looking at this idea of planning your resiliency in advance of knowing what you're actually facing. I mean, I think there are some knowns in the sense that you might plan in an earthquake zone for an earthquake. But I think there's this sense from the Rockefeller Foundation that they're planning for absolutely everything, that you can just be resilient in the face of any knowable or unknowable. And I kind of see Irina's point that, you know, resilience being part of a natural cycle, but I'm not sure you can predict and prepare for it entirely, because then it wouldn't be a shock anymore, and then maybe that wouldn't trigger this great creativity if you were actually, and the tone of a lot of what you read on that website about the 100 resilient cities is really speaks to that fear that, you know, and suggests that you can just, you know, install a flood defense. And this is what they actually said. You can install a flood defense that's also a bike path, and then everything will be fine. People will be healthier, and you won't get flooded. And so I think it does play into that fear that maybe Austin's also referred to. So I guess the sense, the adaptability, or to kind of, I don't think there's any difference if we're designing to adapt or we're designing to be resilient. I suppose that's the same thing. But I would say that it suggests that you can plan ahead to an extent that I think is perhaps suspicious.
I mean, on that, but also other people, please come back, because I sort of read somewhere that Stoke-on-Trent is Britain's first sort of certificated resilient city, you know, because they want to be aware of and planning for earthquakes and the rest of it, which is a bit of a, you know, perhaps ridiculous notion. But isn't resilience also the sign of, shall we say, councils and managerial types looking for new ways to sort of validate, you know, kind of best practice, shall we say? Yeah.
I mean, I think the idea of a resilience officer is completely ludicrous. I mean, I can't imagine what these cities think they're doing, having resilience officers. So all they will do is create a bureaucracy which will prevent the kind of creativity that Irina was and Christine were talking about, which is inherent in people who live in cities. So there is, for me, the problem is partly climate change, it's changing, partly the fact that there is a limited amount of building materials, so you can't go on pulling them down and building them up again, because there just isn't the material in the world to do it. And partly the fact that we had a major economic crisis in 2007, and the banks are still behaving exactly the same way they always did. So we are actually on the receiving end of some quite difficult things to handle, which is why probably some of us get our heads down and get on with what we think we can do.
So could I perhaps come back to you on that, because, you know, from what I understood of what you introduced was a kind of an argument for localism to you know, to a large extent. So isn't that part of, say, Judith Rodin and others sort of kind of notion of resilience as well, is about sort of making headway by being more localized and more connected to the problem. So aren't you kind of, again, sort of on the same lines as these resilient other kind of speakers?
Yeah, I probably. I mean, I like to think of myself as being an optimist, but as this discussion goes on, I find myself progressively alarmed about the fact that actually I can't see any particular way out. I can see groups of people. I work with people in a fairly creative way. We operate at a number of different levels, work with a lot of communities that are trying to get on and make the best of the world they live in and trying to make it a better place. And that's a privilege to be able to do that. But, you know, when I look at some of the big schemes that are going up in London, you know, I think Canary Wharf is the Shard, for instance, is sort of okay. It's a bit old-fashioned. It's a bit of a pity that some idiot put the chillers, took them off the roof and put them in the basement. So they were half as efficient as they were meant to be. But my question is, so what will we use it for in 100 years' time, since we'll clearly never put it down? What value will it have? How do these buildings retain their value? The minute you have electric cars, you don't need air conditioning in Britain.
But can I just quickly push you a bit, because what does that, I mean, I'll be honest, I mean, what does that have to do with resilience? That's what I don't understand.
Well, because... sorry, somebody was saying something? Yeah, I mean...
But aren't we stretching the metaphor like Austin was sort of pushing out? I mean, a bit too far that we're making this whole discussion, you know...
No, I mean, I would argue about us being in a steady-state economy, but the cities will continuously change all the time. Of course, depending on who's there. But at the moment, we're being pulled by big capital that wants to reproduce itself, because that's what it does. And the cities are on the receiving end of this, and we're on the receiving end of it because we live in cities. So that's why I think we do, that's why I go back to the localism, which is there has to be some form of calling people to account, and it's not going to happen with Nigel Farage or, you know, that kind of politics. There is a local politics that I think could be helpful. I would go no stronger than that.
Okay. I just want to ask something to Austin when we come back. So, so Austin, I mean, I kind of get what you're saying about it could be seen as the new sort of orthodoxy, and it's, you know, perhaps used as a metaphor for pretty much everything that we do or don't like, and, you know, taken to the extreme. But isn't there some kind of positive kernel in some of these sort of approaches around resilience? Again, sort of Judith Rodin and others are sort of saying, because it's about, you know, in some ways it might be local sort of kind of creativity, and surely that in some ways is quite a positive thing, where people are actually trying to figure out, you know, fairly swift responses to kind of crises, be they natural disasters or man-made ones, because perhaps, you know, big thinking, big infrastructure and big government is too slow to respond. So, you know, it's taking its place, perhaps.
No. Look, I'm a humanist, okay? I'm a humanist. I put humans first, and I'm also a great believer in creativity. He had the same position. I just really, exactly. I'm being intimidated. Yeah, no, I'm a weak. Anyway, look, so I'm trying to be quick on this, because I recognise I was too long last time. But the idea of individuals being creative, of course, as has ever been the case. That's why we're humans. That's why we're not animals. Unfortunately, animals aren't creative. I'll take that flack later, but, you know, it's just not the case. In the same way as humans don't respond evolutionarily to history, because we change history, we change evolution. We have hospitals, right? We don't grow with 5 heads, right? We're not responsive to the way that animals are. So we have the ability to change things. So human creativity is a fantastic thing. Those things come to being in cities, and that's where we concentrate, and therefore we can combine our creative forces. So I'm all in favor of this, right? The problem about resilience is that we look, the prism of the future is one of fear, of problems, and we're reliant in some bizarre way on disaster to spur creativity. Please, I can be creative without the disaster, right? And I think I can be more creative if I have a 100 or 360 degree view of possibilities than just a 10-degree view. And I think this is the thing that I'm worried about. We are constraining ourselves through the image of resilience rather than liberating ourselves.
But does surely somewhere in your creative thinking disaster and precaution figure to some extent? You know, you're building a building, you have to ensure the foundations are strong enough to cope with, you know, how do you...
Yes, okay. If I'm building in Athens, I build earthquake-resistant buildings, yes? If I'm building a house, I put a foundation down. I mean, we learned about this in the Bible. But I mean, I think that, I don't have a problem, but this is the... Yeah, well, you know, thank God we're not having a discussion at that level. But I mean, those are simple things that we do, right? We understand, we've learned, and all the rest of it. But this is a different thing, right? The idea that maybe there will be civil unrest. This is one of the key issues that is being addressed by resilience, civil unrest. Now, which part of civil unrest do you disagree with out there in the audience, right? Which part of civil unrest do you support? Because me, for one, I have been known to be on rallies and demonstrations, endorsing people's right to fight against things which they find to be, not acceptable, not legal. So I think that there's, if we have this general idea that resilience is something to control our social engagement, to instill some kind of Chinese harmonious social fabric against social unrest in a blanket term, then we have a problem, because that undermines the entire discussion about what we politically believe in. And we're having Judith Rodin, Rockefeller Center, The Guardian, God knows who, deciding what it is that we should be supporting. That's what I worry about.
Okay, yeah.
So I think, here's a question. So the chief resilience officer, this approach where you've got someone at the top who's kind of designing for resilience or engineering for resilience across it. And then the alternative, which is, the unplanned development, the lack of a planning department, humans acting in a hive type way where they are just next to each other doing things. Which is more resilient?
Does anyone else want to come back before Austin?
Let Austin have a go.
You ask us, don't you?
Pardon?
I don't know, I'm asking any.
Well, no, it's open to it. Any.
Irina.
Is your question what's more resilient, having
Yes.
an officer or having
Top down, really, or?
I think both are very valid strategies. I think there's a huge problem with...
Closer to that.
I think they're both very valid strategies. I think one of the biggest problems we have at the moment is that those who are in charge, who we democratically elect to make decisions on our part, are too distant from the creativity and thinking on the ground. And if that person, that poor isolated person, has some ability to bring those two scales of governance together, that will be a very beneficial thing. So at the moment, I think we should be trying all sorts of methodologies to bring, to get the best out of our collective thinking.
I guess another sort of perhaps question then to pose to you is, all of you, and I guess Austin sort of touched on it, who is it that decides then what to be resilient about? Because some things perhaps are fairly obvious, like natural disasters or whatever, the obvious sort of candidates that we need to build stronger buildings. But then I guess, Austin, you're talking about being prepared for riots and, civil unrest, as well as even perhaps around sort of health and so on. Lots of those issues, even the environment, are not necessarily critically debated in public. So the environment, climate change is pretty much treated like a religion, I would argue, by many kind of sort of people in sort of architectural design even. So, who is it for them to kind of judge what is to be resilient against and not, as the case may be? Who wants to?
I quite like to take this one because I'm so irritated by the fact that my great attempt at changing the context of this conversation didn't work. What I'm trying to say is we are no longer in control of everything, and the real resilience is happening on the ground, in communities and neighborhoods, between people who know each other and help each other and have always been helping each other. This is where it's coming from. It's not a question of somebody out there deciding what the agenda is. It is happening absolutely everywhere in response to the current conditions.
So can you, again, I'm not an architect, but can you give me some examples of what you mean then by this sort of ground up sort of resistance, shall we say?
Yes, masses of examples. There's an estate in Hull, which is one of the most deprived estates in England, like really fourth from the bottom. 5,000 people who haven't worked for 3 generations. They've been flooded twice now, massive floods. They are going around the business, creating protection to the communities and setting up spaces which are above floodwater so they can all meet there if there is another flood, and they have a store of food and they have a store of sandbags. They are creating a level of resilience. It doesn't mean they'll survive, but they're certainly creating some level of resilience for the community not to have to go through what they've just been a couple of times.
Okay.
That's an example.
Who wants to come back to that, or also just the point of who decides what to be resilient about? Christine?
Who decides? Who decides?
Or how do you
The Rockefeller Foundation decides.
Okay. That's easy.
There was one worrying little statement on it where they said something like, and then we'll connect you with the suppliers you will need to be resilient, which I thought was a bit strange. But I don't know. I think the interesting thing about who, I don't know, then I get confused about what resilience is if I have to decide what I'm going to be resilient about, so.
I was hearing yesterday about something that I'm sure Austin disapproves of, which is the well-being police in the States, whereby certain large corporations are working hard to make sure they're not going to be subjected to class suits by their employees for providing by encouraging obesity, so that you can't find certain institutions, you cannot find a can of Coke anywhere near the building because of the demonstrable link between that and a death threat. Now, I think it seems pretty extraordinary to me, but if this is what large corporations are trying to make themselves resilient-proof. So, I mean, I think Austin's got a point about challenging some of the assumptions. I just think that as an architect, one works better with constraints than not. It's extremely difficult to design a building in a green field. It's extremely difficult to build some of those cities in China on green fields because there is no history, no time. It's just instant, and there is very little that we value that has come about through that level of instant everything. So I think there's, I like the idea of constraint enormously, and I think that if you add into that constraint of the fact that we just do need to use less, I mean, we need to reduce the carbon emissions, and anyhow, and that means there will be less fuel in the short term. Long term, I'm sure somebody will, well, we've got the sun, so that's fine. We just don't use it. So it seems to me that all those things are very helpful to us, and if you add in the kind of creativity that local communities can generate, then that's good news. But I think the world we live in, which is run by the banks and their puppet governments, are totally uninterested.
I have a question. I warned you that I chair often, so I often have questions. But my question is, could the discourse of resilience be useful for architects? For example, if they wanted to encourage their client to invest in a more creative building technology, could they say, you know, resilience, you should be investing in this?
Okay.
I tried it, and how'd it go?
Sorry, Austin, but I've actually, well, I've tried it because I've encouraged clients to design an adaptation for future climate change, especially for overheating. And we managed to convince one client, and we put all the shutters in that we should have put in, and buildings fully, naturally ventilated, fantastic. Then they had one breaking on the ground floor, and after that they instantly changed the timber adjustable shutters, which are adaptable to future change, into metal closed roller shutters, which means that building is instantly overheating and nothing works anymore. So we're trying.
So I'll give the last sort of word before we bring yourselves in to Austin. I mean, are these the kind of constraints that are going to produce the best sort of architecture?
No. Very clearly. I mean, look, there's two things on restraint. And I say this a lot, and I don't know whether I'm saying it badly because nobody gets it. But actually, no restraints, having an unlimited palette of materials could produce potentially better architecture. Now, it often doesn't, but I think having more choices leads to more choices. Do you understand? So, therefore, I'm in favor of more choices, not limits. However, if you're going through the terrible practical realities of building a building, we all know that, having some restriction on budget and the site, these things are facts of life. However, as a philosophical point, the idea of having no limits is a good thing, and I think that applies societally, politically, as well as in terms of freedom, as well as in terms of the way that we see design and creativity. So I don't look to disaster to spur creativity. I see human beings as inherently creative. That's what's got us here in the first place. And I think we shouldn't really mess in that. I also don't think we should see, what was the phrase that you used, that we're no longer in control. I mean, I think actually historically we are probably more in control today than we ever have been throughout history. And more control is a good thing. If you go to the depths of China, or go to Africa, or go to India, you understand what no control is. So I think that actually having the ability to build roads and have cars and have buildings and really orchestrate your built environment and free yourself from the natural environment is a fundamentally important thing.
Irina, do you want to come back on that very quickly?
Well, I mean, I think it takes my breath away. You can say that we are in more control now than we ever been. I think there's a very nice film called Hunger Games, which pretty much summarizes where we are heading. It's not fictional. It is we are absolutely on that way. And I would love for you to validate why we are now in more control than we have been. We are heading to a complete disaster. We are wiping ourselves off this earth.
Okay, on that cheerful note, I want to get yourselves to contribute. So look, who wants to ask a question, raise a point, even like me, say what is resilience? Please put your hands up so I can see who you are. Oh, yeah, do you want to use